Hi, welcome to iEducator. This is Teacher Jeff. I'm an educator and an engineer by profession. And today we will discuss Chapter 7. And Chapter 7 is all about work capacity, stress, fatigue, and recovery. And in today's lesson, there are 6 key areas that I'm going to be highlighting today. First, we will be discussing stress and fatigue. Second, muscles, structures and functions, and capacity. Third, we have the cardiovascular system. Fourth, the respiratory system. Fifth, the physical work capacity. And finally, we have factors affecting work capacity. Now, in this point, we will be discussing first stress and fatigue. Now remember, stress and fatigue are words used in a variety of ways by ergonomists. Sometimes they are used to refer to temporary states of parts of the body, and at other times, they are used to refer to chronic states of the whole person. And in both senses, stress arising out of work demands causes fatigue when work capacity is exceeded. So, what is meant by stress then? If we talk about stress, it is often thought of in a negative way in everyday life. In technical discussion, however, it is perhaps more appropriately viewed as applied load or task demand. Now, the classical physical model of stress is based on Hooke's law. And Hooke's law states that if we place a load of 30 kilograms on a horizontal beam and the beam bends under the load, then the stress is 30 kilograms and the strain is the deformation of the beam. Once the stress is being removed, then the beam will resume its former shape. Under high loads, the elastic limit of the beam will be exceeded and the beam will not resume its original shape when the stress is removed. So permanent damage results because the stress exceeds the load-bearing capacity. And the classical physiological model of stress is derived from the work of H. Selye espoused in his book, The Stress of Life, Selye 1956. Now, Selye was interested in the endocrinological responses to life events, and his key insight was that many very different nausea stimuli produce the same effects. This leads Selye to coin the term general adaptation syndrome, which means to say a three-phase response to stress consisting of an alarm reaction. When the threat is perceived, then resistance, followed by adaptation, and finally exhaustion or death. Now, to this day, researchers continue to use endocrine markers such as urinary catecholamine concentration and salivary cortisol levels to assess the overall level of work of life stress. It is also believed that former indicates the level of stress and resulting physiological arousal, whereas the latter indicates the degree of emotional response to the situation in which the stress is experienced. This is according to Lundberg 1995. Now, we cannot deny the fact that in ergonomics, specifically in workplace ergonomics, workplace stress can take many forms, right? This being said, the recognition that workplace stress can take many forms has led investigators to develop more complex models. Now, according to Kagan and Levy 1971, they propose that the stress response depends on one's physiobiological disposition or inherited characteristics, training, and experience, and the stressor in combination. And according to Professor T. Cox, he developed a transactional model for workplace stress in which cognitive appraisal of the task demands is the key function in determining the response. Now, what is meant by this? It means that whenever or whether a task is perceived as stressful depends on how the individual appraises the situation, and this will depend on physical and psychological factors as well, such as self-efficacy or one's perceived ability to cope with the demands. And there are at least three different meanings to the term fatigue. First, we have sleepiness. Second, we have tiredness. And lastly, we have it is used when referring to the kind of habituation to a mental task that occurs after prolonged execution that manifests itself as a desire to do something else. Now, fatigue as sleepiness, what we mean about this? Well, sometimes it is used to mean sleepiness or fatigue as a result of sleep deprivation or disruption of circadian rhythms. So whenever a person doesn't get to have enough sleep or as what we call sleep deprivation, then it will lead to fatigue. Also, it is used as a synonym for tiredness. Or example, after running a marathon or lifting heavy weights, okay? And for the last definition, it is used when referring to the kind of habituation to a mental task that occurs after prolonged execution that manifests itself as a desire to do something else. Now, this kind of mental fatigue is actually task-specific. After a driving for many hours, our brains are quite capable of processing the information required to understand a book or enjoy a symphony. With these definitions, we can say that fatigue is usually inferred from its effects, most directly decline in physical or mental task performance. Like stress, it is a term that is used in everyday life, and its value as a scientific construct has long been questioned. Now, according to Ream and Richardson, 1996, they defined fatigue as a subjective, unpleasant symptom which incorporates total body feelings ranging from tiredness to exhaustion, creating an unrelenting overall condition which interferes with individuals' ability to function in their normal capacity. Now, localized muscle fatigue occurs as a result of depletion of nutrient stores, first in the muscle itself, then in the liver, which has a finite capacity to store glycogen. Central fatigue is thought to occur due to changes in the concentration of what we call neurotransmitter, known as 5-HT. That's 5H for hotel and T for tango. That's 5-HT, which is thought to be involved in the control of tiredness. Now, and so for this matter, in essence, fatigue actually manifests itself as an increasing resistance to continuing with a task. So as long as this resistance can be overcome, performance continues, but with subjectively greater effort. Now, in this chapter, we will review some fundamental aspects of human physical function and the relation of work demands, work capacity, and physical fatigue. Now, moving on to our second key area of our lesson for today, that would be muscle structures and functions and capacity. Now, take note, muscles, through the tension they exert when contracting, make physical work possible. Now, there are three types of muscles in the body. We have the skeletal muscles, we have the smooth muscles, and we also have the cardiac muscles. Now, as we discussed in the previous chapters, if this is skeletal muscles, these are connected to the bones and provide the forces and movement needed to carry out external tasks. On the other hand, these are muscles that are connected to the bones of the skeleton, and it passes over joints enabling the bones to act like levers when the muscle contracts. Next, we have cardiac muscles. And when we say cardiac muscles, these are integral parts of the human heart and help it to pump out the blood for circulation. It also has a special structure and constitutes the bulk of the heart. And finally, we have smooth muscles. These are connected to internal organs such as stomach, we have intestines, blood vessels, etc. And these muscles as well are found in the intestines and makes possible the movements essential for the digestion of food, or what we call as peristalsis. It is also found in the walls of blood vessels, where it is involved in the regulation of blood pressure and blood flow. It is not normally considered to be under conscious control. As you can see on figure 7.1, this is the basic structure of skeletal muscle. Now, the energy required for muscle contraction is actually obtained from phosphate compounds in the muscle tissue. And these compounds are formed from the breakdown of food. Now, a brief review of muscle structure and function is appropriate. Now, the contraction of most skeletal muscles is actually under conscious control, and the rate and strength of contraction can be varied at will. Now, a complete muscle is made up of many bundles of fibers called cells, arranged side by side and covered by connective tissue shells. Nerves and blood vessels are located in the connective tissue, and each muscle fiber consists of many smaller myofibrils, which consists of an alternating series of sarcomeres and Z-bands, as you can see on this figure. And as you can see on figure 7.2, this is an example of myofibril. And for figure 7.3, this is the sliding filament theory of muscle contraction. Now, as you can see, a myofibril is split up into a number of sarcomeres arranged in the series, as you can see on figure 7.2. Now, a sarcomere consists of many filaments layered over each other in alternating bands. There are two types of filaments. First, we have the thick filaments, which consist of about 300 molecules of the protein myosin. And second, we have the thin filaments, which consists of a globular protein called actin. Now, the filaments are the true contractile elements of a muscle. Muscles can be likened to bundles of string all joined together. And each individual string or muscle cell is made up of fibers called myofibrils, and each of its structure is bathed in intracellular and extracellular fluid and is permeated by blood vessels and nerves. Now, the mechanism of muscle contraction consists of the actin filaments sliding over the myosin filaments. And since the actin and myosin filaments are arranged in overlapping, alternating bands like a multi-layered sandwich, sliding of the former over the latter causes the sarcomeres to shorten. And note that the filaments themselves do not shorten, as you can see on figure 7.3. As you can see on table 7.1, these are the steps leading to contraction of skeletal muscle. So first, we have a nerve impulse travels along a motor nerve to the motor nerve end plates in the muscle fibers. The second step, a small amount of neurotransmitter is secreted and travels to the membrane of the muscle fiber, initiating an action potential in the muscle fiber. And third step, the action potential travels along and permeates the muscle fiber until it reaches a structure known as the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And fourth step, the The sarcoplasmic reticulum, which acts as a store of calcium ions, releases calcium ions into the myofibrils. This increases the attraction between the actin and myosin filaments, causing the sliding action of one filament over another. And fifth step, the calcium ions are then actively pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. ATP is needed for this, and muscle contraction ceases. And finally, the last step, further nerve impulses cause the process to repeat. Now, according to Goiten 1991, the duration of the calcium pulse from release to reabsorption of calcium ions is about 1:20 of a second. Therefore, in order for continuous muscle contraction to occur, a new impulse must reach the muscle after the calcium pump has removed the calcium ions. Smooth movements of the body are in reality the result of many individual contractions and relaxations of contractile elements throughout the muscle. Now, the amount of muscle contraction that can take place depends on the total change in the length of all the sarcomeres in the muscle. As was discussed in the earlier chapter, muscle contraction is a biochemical process and need not result in shortening of the muscle itself. Instead, it is more accurate to say that muscle contraction consists of the actin filaments tending to slide over the myosin filaments, and that this will result in shortening of the muscle under appropriate circumstances. Further details of this sliding filament theory of muscle contraction and how it underpins the length-tension relationship observed in muscle contraction can be found in the classic paper by Gordon, Julian, and Huxley, 1966. Now, under this, we have energy for action. And energy for muscle contraction and for many other bodily processes comes from the breakdown of a substance known as ATP, or what we call as adenosine triphosphate. By the breaking of one of the phosphate bonds, ATP is converted to ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, and is made available inside the cell. Now, Astrand and Rodel, 1977, liken ATP to a rechargeable battery pack, or a short-term store of directly available energy. And so for this matter, in order for the cell to continue functioning, the ADP must be converted back to ATP, and so the energy can continue to be made available when required. And a second phosphate compound known as creatine phosphate acts like a backup energy store to recharge the ADP to ATP. And in order for muscle filaments to slide backwards and forwards over one another, energy is required. In fact, the actin and myosin filaments are always mutually attracted, and energy is required to break this attraction and allow the muscle to lengthen again. And so for this matter, what will happen during the relaxation phase of muscle contraction then? Well, during the relaxation phase of muscle contraction, ATP is actually needed to weaken the attraction between the actin and myosin filaments. Endurance athletes sometimes experience muscle cramps when a muscle becomes fatigued during an event because the ATP needed to break actin or myosin attraction is depleted. And the creatine phosphate and ATP stores are of very limited capacity and are reduced within seconds or minutes. Now, the creatine phosphate system can actually provide energy for maximal muscle activity for about 8 to 10 seconds and therefore has to be continuously replenished. This takes place in structures inside the cells known as mitochondria. Now, so what will happen if the ATP and creatine phosphate stores are depleted? Well, the moment they are depleted, the muscle will actually go into rigor shortly after death. A state of rigor mortis sets in through the loss of all ADP. And next, we have oxygen dependent and oxygen independent systems. Now, if insufficient oxygen is available, the mitochondria are no longer able to convert the carbohydrate and fatty acids to produce energy. At a second, oxygen independent system becomes the main source of ATP, in which enzymes in the intracellular fluids surrounding the myofilaments and mitochondria use glycogen and blood glucose, but not fat, to produce energy in the absence of oxygen. Now, this backup system actually operates at all times, even at rest, but it is inefficient and produces much less energy per glucose molecule than the oxygen-dependent system. And furthermore, it produces waste products that actually cause the acidity of the muscle cells to increase. And this in turn reduces the affinity between actin and myosin filaments, which in turn weakens our muscle. And oxygen is required to remove these waste products. If it is not available when the person is working, well, the waste products will accumulate. And what will happen under these circumstances? It is said that the person has built up an oxygen debt, which must be paid back when work ceases. And also, efficiency of muscle contraction. Here, the muscular system uses oxygen to convert chemical energy from foodstuff or stored in the tissues or delivered by the bloodstream into mechanical energy via the sliding filament mechanism. Now, this process has a certain efficiency. Yes, muscles are at best only 20% efficient in converting chemical reactants to mechanical output. And heat is the main byproduct of the process. And this heat is produced largely owing to the viscosity of body parts and overcoming friction of blood flowing through capillaries and tendons sliding over joints. So metabolic heat production has important implication for the design of work in extreme climates, as will be seen in a later chapter. So the body system for converting chemical into mechanical energy can malfunction for a number of reasons. So as you can see, we have limiting factors on muscle contractions. The first limiting factor, we have demand for energy exceeds supply. Why is this so? This can occur when chemical fuel stored in the muscle is exhausted and the rate of replenishment of oxygen or glucose is inadequate. And the supply of fuel to working muscle depends on capabilities of the circulatory system. And the second limiting factor on muscle contraction, that would be mechanical capabilities are exceeded. Here, the force output of a muscle is finite and depends on the number of contractile elements, or the maximum strength of a muscle is proportional to its cross-sectional area. A task may exceed the muscle's mechanical capacity. Strength training increases the cross-sectional area of a muscle and the ability to recruit muscle fibers to carry out muscular work. And the third limiting factor, that would be accumulation of waste products impairs muscle function, which I just mentioned earlier. Now in here, this can occur during static muscle activity as described in the previous chapters. And finally, the last limiting factor on muscle contraction, that would be the rate of heat production exceeds the body's thermoregulatory capacity. Now, excess heat can no longer be dissipated and body temperature increases. So, cardiovascular capacity is impaired in this case. And as you can see, under muscle function and fatigue, the function of skeletal muscles is to exert tension between the bony points to which they are attached. Now, tension, remember, is exerted when a muscle changes from its resting to its active state in response to impulses from the central nervous system. And the maximum tension in a muscle can exert depends on its maximum cross-sectional area and also its length. And the term muscle contraction refers to the physiological or physiologically active state of the muscle rather than its physical shortening. And also take note that muscles are able to contract eccentrically, isometrically, and concentrically. If we say eccentric contraction, it means that the muscle lengthens while contracting. If we say isometric contractions, it means that the muscle length remains constant during contraction. And finally, if we say concentric contraction, it means that the muscle shortens while contracting. Now, if we try to illustrate these different muscle contractions, it can be best illustrated by considering the action of the elbow extensors, such as our triceps muscles of a person doing push-ups. Why? Because when these muscles contract concentrically, the body is actually raised off the floor because the shortening of the muscle causes the elbows to extend. They contract eccentrically when lowering the body to the floor, and the eccentric contraction acts like a brake. It controls the rate at which the muscles increase their length and at which the elbows flex. So this enables the body to be lowered smoothly to the floor in a controlled way. And if the person pauses halfway, isometric contraction is required to counteract the downward pull of gravity and maintain the position of the body in space. And next, we also have control of muscle function. Remember that skeletal muscle contains afferent and efferent fibers from the central nervous system. Some of these form complex feedback loops. Receptors in the muscle body provide information about the length of the muscle and its tension, shown in figure 7.5. Now, as you can see on the illustration, this is figure 7.5, and it is all about the positive and negative feedback that comes from receptors in the muscles and a feedback loop at the spinal cord. Now, this is conducted to the spinal cord and to higher levels of the central nervous system. The knee-jerk reflex is a well-known example of a feedback loop, which is made possible by a neural circuit between the stretch receptors in the muscle spindles and motor neurons in the spinal cord. So what usually happens when the muscle is lengthened is that the stretch reflex come into operation, causing the muscle to contract. That is, the reflex opposes the lengthening of the muscle. And therefore, muscle tension is detected by an organ known as the Golgi tendon organ, which is found at the point where small bundles of muscle fibers fuse with tendon fibers. The Golgi tendon organ forms a negative feedback system which prevents damaging levels of tension from building up in the muscle and possibly damaging the muscle fibers or the insertions of the tendons. And next we have fatigue and discomfort. According to Branton 1969, he suggested that discomfort results in an urge to move caused by a number of physical and physiological factors. Pressure on soft tissues can cause ischemia, or what we call as depletion of the local blood supply to the tissues, resulting in a shortage of oxygen and a buildup of carbon dioxide and waste products such as lactic acid. Now, this is known to lead to sensations of pain or discomfort. And fatigue may ultimately occur owing to the depletion of metabolites or glucose or glycogen, which is stored in the muscle and may be readily converted to glucose. Now, depletion of muscle glycogen is one of the main causes of fatigue in endurance athletes such as marathon runners, because when muscles contract, they actually occlude the blood vessels within them and thus diminish their own blood supply. So during sustained isometric contractions, the muscle is actually starved of oxygen and waste products accumulate as oxygen independent metabolic processes take place. And discomfort and fatigue occur rapidly during sustained isometric contractions for this reason. What we have here is fatigue and prolonged exertion. So according to Romer 1960, the value of an individual's maximum static exertion in a particular posture can be used to estimate their endurance time for a submaximal exertion in that posture using the equation below. So our formula that would be T equals negative 90 plus the quantity of 126 divided by P minus the quantity of 36 over P squared plus the quantity of 6 over P cubed, where P refers to the required exertion expressed as a decimal fraction of the maximum exertion, and our T refers to the predicted endurance time in seconds. Now, in order for us to better understand this, let us have an example. So, for example, if an operator had to exert a grip force of 25 kilograms while carrying a milk crate and his maximum grip force was 50 kilograms, then the endurance time would be given by, so using our formula, we have T equals negative 90 plus the quantity of 126 over P minus 36 over P squared plus 6 over P cubed. So remember, P is the required exertion, right? And it is expressed as a decimal fraction of the maximum exertion. So therefore, in getting P, we need to have the 25 kilograms divided by 50 kilograms. And so this will leave us 0.50. And simply, since we already have the value of our P, all we need to do is to plug in this value to our formula. And plugging in this value, we get an answer of 66 seconds. And this is our predicted endurance time in seconds, okay? So this is how we get or calculate the predicted endurance time. Now, we also have fatigue and pain. And remember that skeletal muscle can be regarded as the largest organ in the body. It is the essential for, or it is essential rather, for all activities involving voluntary movement. Repeated or sustained activities, rapid movements, and large forces can actually stimulate pain receptors in a muscle. And so for that matter, since skeletal muscle makes up 40% of the tissues of the body, it should come as no surprise that many of the aches and pains that we actually experience in our daily lives are of muscular origin. And next we have electromyography. What do we mean by this? Now, before discussing about that, we have here discomfort, and discomfort is a subjective experience that can result from a combination of physiological and psychological processes, including muscle fatigue. And muscle fatigue is a physiological phenomenon that can be observed directly using techniques such as electromyography or EMG. Now, take note that muscle cells are arranged in functional units known as motor units. Each motor unit is connected to a single nerve fiber, and all of the cells in that unit fire in response to an impulse from the fiber on an on-off basis. And the number of muscle cells per motor unit varies considerably between muscles. So we have calf or soleus muscle motor units contain mainly hundreds of muscle cells, whereas those in the eye muscles contain as few as 5, and the latter muscles are capable of much finer, coordinated movement because of their superior innervation. Key area that we're going to be discussing right now, that would be the cardiovascular system. So this is how our cardiovascular system looks like. And remember, the cardiovascular system performs a number of functions. First, it collects oxygen from the lungs, food from the gut, and delivers them to the cells of the body. Second, it also collects waste products and delivers them to the excretory organs. Hormones secreted by the endocrine glands in various parts of the body are transported to target cells in other organs by the blood. And finally, the cardiovascular system is involved in thermoregulation, or the control of body temperature. Now, the average adult has about 5 liters of blood. So, approximately 2.75 liters consist of plasma and 2.25 liters of blood cells. So there are 3 main types of blood cells. First, we have red blood cells or erythrocytes, which transports oxygen. Second, we have white blood cells or leukocytes, which fight infection. And lastly, we have platelets, which are required for blood clotting. So this is an example of red blood cells. And take note that red blood cells are formed in bone marrow, and they contain a red pigment or heme that is bound to a protein molecule called globin. So hemoglobin combines with oxygen to form oxymoglobin, the form in which oxygen is carried in the blood. And this is an example of white blood cells. Like I said earlier, these white blood cells are responsible in fighting infections. And finally, we have plasma. And plasma consists of 90% water and 10% solutes, or food, proteins, and salts. Hemoglobin absorbs oxygen, a process known as oxygenation, in the lungs, and oxygenated blood returns from the lungs to the left atrium of the heart via the pulmonary vein. It passes to the left ventricle, where it is pumped via the aorta to the tissues of the body through a series of ever-branching blood vessels. Most tissues of the body are permeated by capillaries, tiny blood vessels with internal diameters not much larger than our red blood cells. So the next key area that we're going to be discussing right now, that would be the respiratory system. And this is how our respiratory system looks like. And remember, a respiratory system functions as a gas exchanger, okay? And it supplies the body with oxygen and removes carbon dioxide. It also consists of the nose, the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and the lungs. So in nasal cavity, the responsibility of the nose, it actually filters incoming air, warms and humidifies it, and tests for substances that may be harmful to the respiratory tract. The nasal epithelium is lined with mucus. What usually happens to the small particles in the turbulent incoming air is that these particles become trapped in the mucus, which flows under the action of cilia to the pharynx, where it is swallowed. But before reaching the trachea, incoming air is actually warmed almost to the body temperature and humidified to almost 100%. On the other hand, for the pharynx, Pharynx is also known as the throat. It is a muscular tube that serves as the entrance or hallway for the respiratory and digestive tracts. It plays an important role in the forming of vowel sounds in speech. And this is what we call as phonation. On the other hand, we also have larynx, and the larynx lies at the upper end of the trachea and just below the pharynx. It is actually a part of the open passage through which air travels on its way to the lungs and protects the lungs against the ingress of solids. It is also the organ of voice production. And for trachea, the trachea is also known as windpipe. It is a tube of cartilage and muscle about 2.5 centimeters in diameter, extending from the larynx in the neck to the thoracic cavity or chest, where it divides into two smaller tubes, the primary bronchi. And the bronchi or bronchioles, it divides many times into increasingly smaller tubes that finally terminate in microscopic sacs, or what we call as alveoli. The alveoli are in contact with capillaries containing blood pumped from the heart via the pulmonary artery, and it is here that gaseous exchange takes place. Okay, so this is all about the respiratory system. And the next key area that I'm gonna be discussing right now, that would be the physical work capacity. And take note that we have here basal metabolic rate, or what we call as BMR. If we say BMR, it is the rate of energy consumption necessary to maintain life. So people as we are, we actually differ in terms of our BMR. For example, the relative BMR of a child is about twice that of an adult. The decrease in BMR with age is one of the reasons for adult middle age spread, and the BMR can drop by about 20% in chronically malnourished individuals. We also have physical work capacity, and if we say physical work capacity, it refers to a worker's capacity for energy output. This means that this will depend primarily on the energy available to the worker in the form of food and oxygen, and the sum of energy provided by oxygen-dependent and oxygen-independent processes. This means that the rate of energy consumption during physical work is the sum of the basal energy consumption and the metabolic cost of the work in terms of energy consumption. And finally, the last key area of our lesson for today, that would be the factors affecting work capacity. And in actuality, there are a couple reasons or factors affecting our physical work capacity. It can be categorized as personal factor and environmental factor. For personal factors, we have age, body weight, gender, alcohol consumption, tobacco smoking, active or non-active, lifestyle, training or sport, nutritional status, and motivation. And under environmental factors, we have atmospheric pollution, indoor air quality, ventilation, altitude, noise, and extreme heat or cold. Now, how come age is one factor affecting physical work capacity? Well, this is considered as one factor affecting physical work capacity because age has a significant effect on the work capacity. So the younger you are, meaning to say, the younger you are capable of working effectively and efficiently. However, the older you are no longer capable of effecting. Your capability of becoming an effective and efficient worker will actually diminish or decrease. On the other hand, body weight is considered as one factor affecting physical work capacity because body weight, particularly the percentage of body tissue that is composed of fat, influences all activities in which the worker has to move his own body. For example, we have walking, cycling, climbing ladders, or stairs. And for gender, this is considered as one of the factors affecting physical work capacity because most of the difference in work capacity is really due to differences in body size. In general, remember, women do appear to have lower upper body strength, controlling for body size. Aerobic capacity is 206, introduction to ergonomics also lower. On average, owing to a larger proportion of subcutaneous fat in women. However, for most aspects of physical performance, males and females should be considered as overlapping distributions, and selections tests should be based on the ability to carry out critical job functions. Also, alcohol consumption is considered as one of the factors affecting physical work capacity because alcohol may increase cardiac output in submaximal work and thereby reducing cardiac efficiency. It also affects liver function and can cause a predisposition to hypoglycemia or low blood glucose. And also, tobacco smoking can be a factor affecting physical work capacity because tobacco smoke contains about 4% by volume carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide has an affinity for hemoglobin or combining to form carbohemoglobin 200 times as powerful as that of oxygen. Now, the moment we smoke, smoking therefore reduces work capacity by reducing the oxygen carrying capacity of our blood. It also causes chronic damage to the respiratory system, which impairs the ventilation of our lungs and the transfer of oxygen from the air to the blood. Because tobacco smoke also contains a very large number of toxic and carcinogenic chemicals that are likely to have a generally depressing effect on the physical capacity of smokers. And also we have training or sport. Now, the reason this is considered as a factor affecting physical work capacity because work capacity can be enhanced by physical training to increase a worker's volume dioxide max and job training in more efficient work methods to obtain more output per liter of oxygen because specific training regimes can be developed to strengthen particular parts of the musculoskeletal system with the goal of improving performance or preventing injury. And also we have nutrition status. And nutrition status is considered as a factor affecting physical work capacity because a balanced diet is actually important to ensure adequate amounts of necessary foodstuffs and to minimize the accumulation of excess body fat. So if we don't get that much nutrition that we actually need on a daily basis, then it will actually affect our physical work capacity. All right, I think that's a good place to stop. If you have questions, please let me know on the comment section below. And if you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button for the latest updates. Thank you.